Imagine looking death in the face and booping it on the nose. That was Morgause's plan. She was the former general of the Silver River Pack, a warrior born in blood and steel, now dragged in chains before the Alpha King Malakai, a man rumors said ate hearts for breakfast and used ribs for toothpicks. The other conquered wolves brought him tributes of gold, diamonds, or ancient blades to beg for their lives. Morgause brought a plushie, a dirty, one-eared teddy bear she found in the rubble of the home he destroyed. She didn't want his mercy. She wanted him to rip her throat out so she could finally spit in his face one last time. But when the fluff hit the floor, the monster didn't roar. He smirked, and that was infinitely more terrifying. Hey everyone, welcome back to Raven's Library. You know, one of my favorite things about this community is realizing just how far our pack actually extends. We have listeners tuning in from all corners of the world, and I think that is incredible. So, before we dive into today's story, I want to do a quick roll call. Scroll down to the comments right now and let me know, where in the world are you listening from today? Whether you're in New York, London, Manila, or a small town nobody knows, I want to see where our pack is scattered around the globe. Represent your city or country down below. Done? Awesome. Now grab a blanket, get comfortable, and let's find out what happens when you give a ruthless Alpha King a teddy bear. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The floor of the Great Hall was colder than a traitor's heart, but Morgause refused to shiver. If she was going to die today, she would die standing, not trembling like the line of pathetic sycophants ahead of her. The air smelled of pine, roasted meat, and the acrid stench of terror sweat. It was the Winter Solstice Offering. The one day a year the Alpha King Malakai allowed his conquered subjects to buy their continued existence with lavish gifts. Morgause adjusted the iron manacles chafing her wrists. They were heavy, designed to dampen a shifter's strength, but they couldn't dampen the fire burning in her gut. She was the Iron Rose, general of the Silver River Pack, or she had been, before Malakai's shadow army turned her home into a crater. Now, she was just another prisoner in a line of the damned. Next, the royal heralds barked. A wolf from the southern clans stepped forward, shaking so hard his jewelry rattled. He dropped to his knees, offering a velvet pillow. "My king," the man squeaked, "a dagger forged from a fallen star. It cuts through bone like water." Morgause rolled her eyes. Boring. On the obsidian throne, King Malakai leaned back. He was massive, even in human form. Broad shoulders clad in black fur and leather, dark hair falling over eyes that looked like frozen lakes. He didn't even look at the dagger. He looked bored. Lethally bored. With a flick of his hand, he signaled for the gift to be taken, and the man to be removed. Next. Morgause didn't wait to be shoved. She stepped forward, her chains clanking loudly in the silent hall. The sound echoed like a challenge. The guards on either side of the throne tensed, hands drifting to their swords. They recognized her. They knew how many of their brothers she had put in the ground before they finally captured her. Malakai's gaze shifted. For the first time in hours, the boredom fractured. He sat up straighter, his predator instincts locking onto her. "The general," Malakai's voice rumbled, deep enough to vibrate through the soles of her boots. "I expected you to be executed weeks ago. My guards must have a soft spot for lost causes." "They tried," Morgause said, her voice raspy from disuse but steady as stone. "I bit one of them. He got an infection. It was a whole ordeal." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. No one spoke to the Winter King like that, not if they wanted to keep their tongue. Malakai tilted his head, a dangerous glint entering his eyes. "And what tribute does a prisoner with nothing left bring a king who has everything?" Morgause reached into the tattered remains of her tunic. The guards drew their blades instantly, expecting a hidden knife. But she didn't pull out steel. She pulled out a bear. It was small, brown, and missing its left ear. The stuffing was poking out of a hole in its stomach, and it smelled faintly of smoke. It was the saddest, most pathetic object in a room filled with diamonds and gold. Morgause held it up by its remaining ear. "I watched the other packs bring you weapons and wealth," she announced, her voice ringing clear to the back of the hall. But I know what you really are, Malakai. She took a step closer. The guards yelled for her to halt, but she ignored them. You throw tantrums when you don't get your way. You break things that don't belong to you. You are nothing but a spoiled child sitting in a big chair. She tossed the bear. It tumbled through the air in a slow, fluffy arc. It bounced once off the tip of Malakai's heavy combat boot and landed softly on the polished stone. So, Morgause finished, spreading her chained hands, I brought you a toy. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes an explosion. The entire court stopped breathing. The guards looked at the king, waiting for the order to sever her head. Morgause lifted her chin, exposing her throat, ready for the end. She smiled. She had won. She had insulted the devil to his face. Malakai slowly stood up. He towered over the dais, casting a long shadow that swallowed her whole. He looked down at the teddy bear, then up at her. His claws began to extend, sharp and black as obsidian. But he didn't strike. Instead, the corner of his mouth twitched. Chapter 2. The twitch in the king's lip didn't vanish. It grew. It curled upward, slow and sharp, transforming his stoic mask into a smirk that was infinitely more dangerous than a snarl. Malakai descended the dais, each heavy footfall echoing like a gavel striking a sounding block. The court nobles pressed themselves back against the stone pillars, desperate to be invisible. They knew what happened when the Winter King came down from his high seat. Usually it involved a lot of screaming and a lot of bleach to clean up afterwards. Morgause didn't flinch. She kept her eyes locked on his, her chin raised in defiant invitation. Do it, she silently dared him. Make me a martyr. Malakai stopped inches from her. He smelled of ozone and deep winter frost, a scent so overpowering it made the hair on Morgause's arms stand up. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he bent down and plucked the one-eared teddy bear from the floor. He held the toy up to the light, inspecting the loose thread hanging from its belly. His massive hand engulfed the thing. A single squeeze would turn it into lint. Captain, Malakai said, his voice deceptively light. The captain of the guard, a brute with a scar bisecting his nose, stepped forward eagerly, his sword already half drawn. Yes, sire. I will remove her head immediately. I apologize that this filth was allowed to— Silence, Malakai snapped, not looking away from the bear. The captain's mouth clicked shut so fast his teeth audibly cracked. Malakai turned the bear over, his thumb brushing the dirty fabric. Then he looked at Morgause. The amusement in his eyes was cold, glittering, and terrifyingly intelligent. You say I am a child, Malakai mused, his voice carrying to every corner of the frozen hall. And you, the defeated general of a burnt pack, thought the wisest course of action was to give a child a toy. I thought the wisest course of action was to choke you on it, Morgause spat. The crowd gasped. Someone in the back actually fainted. Malakai chuckled. It was a dark, rich sound that seemed to rattle the stained glass windows. Honesty, he said, addressing the room at large. Do you hear that? I haven't heard an honest word in this throne room since I conquered it. You all bring me gold you stole from peasants or weapons you're too cowardly to use against me, but this— He held up the ragged bear. This is personal. This has hate in it. He looked back at Morgause, his smirk widening. Best gift ever. Morgause blinked, her warrior's composure slipping for a fraction of a second. Excuse me? However, Malakai continued, his tone dropping an octave, becoming serious. You are right. A child needs supervision, and since you seem so concerned with my maturity, I think you're the perfect candidate for the job. Before Morgause could process the words, Malakai moved. He was faster than anything that size had a right to be. He seized her shackled wrists in one hand. With an effortless twist of his shoulder, he snapped the heavy iron chains as if they were made of spun sugar. Morgause rubbed her wrists, confused. You're freeing me? Hardly. Malakai grabbed her forearm, his grip bruising. His eyes flared with a sudden, violent crimson light. You wanted to die, General. You wanted the easy way out, but I don't give my enemies what they want. Let go of me, Morgause snarled, trying to shift, to bring out her wolf claws. But his aura slammed into her, suppressing her beast with sheer, overwhelming dominance. I, Malakai, Alpha of the Black Frost, accept your tribute, he intoned, the ancient words thrumming with power. And by the laws of the pack, I claim the giver. A band of searing heat wrapped around Morgause's wrist where he held her. It felt like a branding iron. She screamed, dropping to her knees, but he didn't let go. Red markings, ancient runes of binding, began to etch themselves into her skin, spiraling up her arm like living tattoos. "What are you doing?" she gasped, watching the magic settle into her flesh. Malakai released her. She scrambled back, clutching her arm. The pain faded, leaving behind a dull, throbbing connection. She could feel him. She could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart in the back of her mind. "You tried to kill me with a gesture," Malakai said, turning his back on her and walking toward the stairs. "Now you will ensure I live. If my heart stops, yours stops. If I bleed, you bleed." He paused at the throne, looking back over his shoulder at her horrified expression. "Welcome to the Royal Guard, General. Your shift starts now." Chapter 3. "This is a mistake," Morgause muttered, staring at the double doors of the royal suite. They were carved from solid mahogany and depicted wolves eating what looked like very terrified deer. A massive, colossal, history book-level mistake. "The only mistake," Malakai said, pushing the doors open without breaking stride, "was thinking you could throw a stuffed animal at a king and walk away without a job." Morgause followed him because she had no choice. The invisible tether of the blood oath tugged at her sternum like a fishhook every time she lagged more than 10 feet behind him. It was humiliating. She was a general who had commanded 3,000 soldiers. Now she was a glorified golden retriever on a psychic leash. The royal suite was disgusting. Not because it was dirty, it was spotless, but because of the sheer, unadulterated opulence. The carpet was so thick it nearly swallowed her boots. The fireplace was large enough to roast an ox. And the bed was the size of a small island, draped in furs that probably cost more than her entire pack's yearly food budget. "You take the floor," Morgause said immediately, crossing her arms. Malakai paused in the middle of unbuckling his heavy leather chest piece. He looked at her, an eyebrow raised. "This is my room. That is my bed. I am the king. Do I need to draw you a diagram?" "I am a prisoner of war," Morgause shot back. "I have rights. The Geneva Convention—" "Doesn't apply to shifters," Malakai finished. He tossed the chest piece onto a velvet armchair. "And you aren't a prisoner. You are the Royal Guard. Your duty is to ensure I survive the night. Hard to do that from the hallway." He pulled his shirt over his head. Morgause aggressively looked at a painting on the wall to avoid noticing that the tyrant was carved out of granite. Scars crisscrossed his back, silver burns, claw marks, old jagged lines that told stories of wars she hadn't been part of. He looked less like a king, and more like a riot shield that had seen too much use. "I'm taking the couch," she announced, marching toward a fainting sofa that looked uncomfortable enough to keep her angry. "Suit yourself," Malakai grunted. He collapsed onto the bed, face down, and didn't move. "Don't snore. I execute snorers." "I don't snore," Morgause lied. "I plot silently." Within minutes, the king's breathing evened out. Morgause sat in the dark, her back rigid against the stiff upholstery. She shouldn't be here. She should be dead, or at least in a dungeon plotting an escape. Instead, she was babysitting the man who had burned her world down. She watched him. For a monster, he slept poorly. Every few minutes, Malakai flinched. His fingers curled into claws against the sheets, and a low, distressed growl vibrated in his throat. He wasn't dreaming of conquest, he was dreaming of threats. It was the sleep of a man who expected a knife in the back every time he closed his eyes. "Good," Morgause thought bitterly. "I hope the nightmares eat you alive." Hours bled into the silence of the castle. The fire died down to embers. The wind howled outside, rattling the heavy glass of the balcony doors. Then the wind changed. Morgause's nose twitched. Beneath the smell of dying embers and pine, there was something else. Acrid. Sweet. Like copper dipped in sugar. Wolfsbane. The scent wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the balcony. Morgause was moving before her conscious mind processed the threat. The instinct that had kept her alive through a decade of border wars took over. She didn't shout. Shouting took time. She launched herself off the couch, crossing the distance to the bed in a blur of motion. A shadow detached itself from the darkness of the balcony railing. A click echoed. The mechanical snap of a crossbow trigger. Malakai was still asleep, his back turned to the window. "Down!" Morgause roared. She dove, slamming her shoulder into Malakai's side. The impact knocked the massive Alpha off the mattress just as the air hissed. Thwack. A black bolt, dripping with viscous green liquid, shattered the mahogany headboard exactly where Malakai's skull had been a second ago. Morgause hit the floor hard, Malakai's heavy weight landing partially on top of her. He woke up swinging, a roar of confusion and rage erupting from his chest, his claws instantly at her throat before he realized who she was. "Don't kill me!" she hissed, shoving his hand away and pointing at the bed. "Kill him!" She pointed to the window where the shadow was already knocking a second arrow. Chapter 4. "Get behind me!" Malakai roared, the command laced with enough alpha authority to crack the plaster on the walls. Morgause, naturally, ignored him completely. She didn't scramble for cover, she scrambled for the balcony. She vaulted over the stone railing into the freezing night air, her boots skidding on the icy slate of the lower roof. The assassin was fast, a blur of gray cloak and shadow magic. But Morgause was fueled by a decade of repressed rage and a very recent adrenaline spike. "Stop!" she screamed, though she knew the assassin wouldn't. The figure leaped across a 10-foot gap between the palace spires, landing with unnatural silence. Morgause didn't hesitate. She launched herself after him. For a second, she was weightless, suspended over a 100-foot drop into the jagged courtyard below. She landed hard, rolling to absorb the impact, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She was gaining. She could smell the intruder now, not just wolfsbane, but stale sweat and something rot-like. Magic. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the gray cloak. The assassin spun, throwing a handful of black dust into her face. Morgause coughed, blinded, stumbling back as the shadows seemed to rise up and swallow the figure whole. By the time she blinked the grit from her eyes, the roof was empty. Damn it! She kicked a gargoyle, nearly breaking her toe. A heavy hand clamped onto her shoulder, spinning her around. Malakai stood there, chest heaving, his eyes glowing a furious, radioactive crimson. He hadn't bothered to put on a shirt, and the freezing wind seemed to bounce off his radiating heat. "Are you insane?" he snarled, shaking her. "I gave you a direct order." "I almost had him," Morgause shouted back, shoving his hand off. "If you hadn't stopped to put on pants, we would have caught him." "You are my guard, not my hound." Malakai grabbed her arm, dragging her away from the edge. "Your place is between me and the blade, not chasing shadows across the rooftops like a suicidal squirrel." "I am a general. I lead from the front. You are mine." The word hung in the air, heavy and possessive. Malakai looked like he wanted to throttle her. "And I don't break my toys. Come with me." He didn't lead her back to the bedroom. He dragged her down a spiral staircase into the lower levels of the royal wing, kicking open the double doors to a private training dojo. The room was lined with mats and smelled of old leather and violence. "You want to fight?" Malakai walked to the center of the mat, his muscles coiling. "Show me you can survive." "I don't need to prove anything to you," Morgause spat, though she stepped onto the mat. Her blood was singing. She needed to hit something. "Attack me." Morgause didn't wait for a countdown. She lunged, aiming a high kick at his temple. Malakai blocked it with a lazy forearm, but the impact echoed like a gunshot. He didn't counterattack. He just watched her, analyzing. She threw a flurry of punches, ribs, throat, solar plexus. He parried them all, his movements fluid, efficient. It was infuriating. He was treating her like a novice. Too slow, he taunted, sidestepping a sweep. Telegraphing. Is this how the Silver River Pack fought? No wonder you burned. That did it. Morgause let out a feral snarl. She feinted left, dropped low, and used her momentum to drive her shoulder into his midsection. It caught him off guard. Malakai stumbled back, breathless. Before he could recover, she swept his legs. The king hit the mat with a satisfying thud. Morgause was on him instantly, straddling his chest, her forearm pressed against his windpipe. "I burned," she hissed, her face inches from his. "Because you cheated." For a moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing. Malakai wasn't fighting back. He lay there looking up at her. His skin was hot against her legs, slick with sweat. The anger in his eyes shifted, morphing into something darker, something hungry. Morgause froze. The adrenaline that had driven her to attack him suddenly curdled into a very different kind of tension. She became acutely aware of the hard planes of his chest beneath her, the way his hands had come up to grip her waist. Not to throw her off, but to steady her. Malakai's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. The air between them crackled, charged with the dangerous, intoxicating scent of an alpha recognizing a mate. Morgause's heart hammered against her ribs, betraying her. She should pull away. She should crush his windpipe. Instead, she leaned in. Malakai's pupils dilated. His grip on her waist tightened, his thumbs digging into her hips. Then, abruptly, he shoved her. It wasn't violent, but it was forceful. Morgause rolled off him, landing in a crouch. Malakai stood up instantly, turning his back to her. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his shoulders tense. "Get out," he said, his voice rough like gravel grinding together. "Malakai." "I said get out." He turned, pointing a trembling finger at the door. The lust was gone, replaced by a wall of ice. "Go back to the suite. Guard the door. Do not follow me." "Where are you going?" "To find something to kill that isn't you," he growled. He looked at her one last time, his expression unreadable. "Do not die for me, Wolf. That is an order." He stormed out of the dojo, leaving Morgause alone on the mats, her skin still burning where he had touched her. Chapter 5. The silence between them the next morning was heavier than the iron armor Morgause was forced to wear. After the incident in the dojo, the almost kiss, the shove, the abrupt dismissal, Malakai had retreated behind a wall of glacial indifference. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak to her. He simply marched toward the High Council chamber like a man walking to his own execution, expecting her to follow. And she did follow. Not because she wanted to, but because the blood oath itching under her skin gave her no choice. The council chamber smelled of stale perfume, old paper, and rotting ambition. 12 high-backed chairs were arranged in a semicircle occupied by the elders of the Black Frost. Wolves so old and shriveled they looked like they'd turn to dust if the wind blew too hard. But Morgause knew better. These weren't frail grandfathers, they were vipers in velvet. Malakai took his seat at the head of the table. He didn't sit like a king. He sat like a prisoner. Morgause took her post behind his right shoulder, hand resting on the hilt of her sword, her eyes scanning the room for threats. "You are late, sire," Elder Gwaine rasped. Gwaine was the head of the council, a man with skin like parchment and eyes like 2 black beads of oil. "We have been discussing the grain requisitions for the Southern Delta." "I know," Malakai said, his voice flat. "I signed the order this morning. 300 tons of wheat to be delivered immediately." Gwaine smiled, a stretching of thin lips that showed too many teeth. "We countermanded that order. The grain stays in the capital." Morgause stiffened. The Southern Delta packs were starving. Their hunting grounds had been decimated during the war. "They will die without it," Malakai said, his grip on the armrest tightening until the wood groaned. "Let them die," another elder chirped, waving a jeweled hand. "Weakness culls the herd. It is the law of the wild. If we feed the conquered, they will only grow strong enough to bite the hand that rules them." Morgause frowned. This didn't fit the narrative. Malakai was supposed to be the tyrant. He was the one who burned her home. Yet here he was, fighting for the lives of the lower packs while these ancient politicians treated genocide like a line item on a budget spreadsheet. "We are not wild animals," Malakai growled, his eyes flashing amber. "We are a kingdom. A king protects his subjects." "A king protects his power," Gawain corrected softly. "You have grown soft, Malakai. Perhaps it is the guilt. You still weep over the Silver River campaign, don't you?" The mention of her pack hit Morgause like a physical blow. "That was a necessary purge," Gawain continued, idly adjusting his silk cravat. "Those wolves were rabid dogs, treacherous, filthy little mongrels who deserved to be put down. Honestly, we should have salted the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. It is a shame we didn't kill them all slowly." The room went cold. Malakai tensed, sensing the spike in Morgause's heart rate through the bond. "Gawain," he warned low. But it was too late. Morgause didn't think. She didn't calculate. She stepped out from the shadows behind the throne. The sound of her boots striking the marble floor echoed like a gunshot. "Speak of my dead again," Morgause said, her voice a quiet, trembling calm that was far scarier than a scream, "and I will cut out your tongue and feed it to you." The council gasped. 12 pairs of outraged eyes snapped to her. "How dare you?" Gawain slammed his hand on the table. "You allow this slave to threaten a high elder?" "She is not a slave," Malakai said, standing up. He placed his body between Morgause and the table, blocking her from their view. "She is the royal guard, and she is right. Watch your tone, Gawain. Even vipers can be crushed under a boot." Malakai grabbed Morgause's arm and hauled her toward the exit before she could unsheath her sword and start a massacre. "Meeting adjourned," he barked over his shoulder. As the heavy doors swung shut behind them, Morgause caught one last glimpse of Elder Gawain. He wasn't looking at Malakai. He was looking directly at her, his black eyes narrowing with a dawn of realization. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked hungry. Gawain leaned over to the guard standing beside him and whispered 3 words that Morgause's sharp ears caught just before the latch clicked. "She's the variable." Chapter 6. "Walk faster," Malakai growled, his grip on Morgause's elbow tight enough to leave bruises through her leather armor. He didn't stop marching until they were 3 corridors away from the council chamber, safe behind the heavy oak doors of his private study. He released her with a shove. "You have a death wish, General? Is that it? You couldn't find a cliff high enough, so you decided to throw yourself onto a council elder's ego?" Morgause stumbled but regained her footing instantly, spinning to face him. "He called my people dogs. He laughed about burning them alive. If you expect me to stand there and wag my tail, you bought the wrong wolf. I expect you to stay alive," Malakai roared, kicking a heavy wooden chair across the room. It shattered against the stone wall. "Gawain isn't just an old man with bad breath. He controls the treasury. He controls the priesthood. If he decides you die, you disappear. And because of this cursed oath, if you disappear, I have a very bad day." He stormed over to a crystal decanter on his desk, pouring a glass of amber liquid with shaking hands. He downed it in one swallow, his back to her. Morgause stayed silent, her chest heaving. She wanted to scream at him, to accuse him of being Gawain's puppet, but the memory of him stepping between her and the table held her tongue. He hadn't thrown her to the wolves, he had shielded her. She paced the room to burn off the adrenaline. It was a soldier's habit, mapping the perimeter. The study was a stark contrast to the opulent bedroom. It was cluttered with maps, strategic ledgers, and architectural blueprints for aqueducts and grain silos. It looked less like the office of a tyrant and more like the workspace of a man desperately trying to keep a crumbling kingdom from falling apart. Her eyes swept over the bookshelves, scanning titles on history and law. Then her gaze stopped. She blinked. She took a step closer, squinting to make sure the dim light wasn't playing tricks on her. There, on the highest shelf, resting on a small cushion of midnight blue velvet, was the bear. It looked ridiculous. It was dirty, ragged, and missing an eye. But it wasn't thrown in a trash bin. It was displayed like a crown jewel. And the ear, the one that had been torn half off when she found it in the rubble, had been reattached. Morgause reached up, her fingers hovering inches from the toy. The stitching wasn't crude cotton. It was gold. Someone had taken painstaking care to sew the ragged brown fur back together with the finest, shimmering gold thread. Stop staring at it. Morgause jumped, hand dropping to her sword hilt. Malakai was watching her over the rim of his glass. His anger had simmered down into a brooding exhaustion. "You kept it," she said, the accusation dying in her throat. "And you fixed it." "I didn't fix it," Malakai muttered, looking away. "I improved its structural integrity." "With gold thread?" "It was the only thread available." He lied. He was a terrible liar. Morgause looked back at the bear. Kintsugi. The art of repairing broken pottery with gold to show that the breakage is part of the history, not something to disguise. "Why?" she asked softly. "It was an insult. I threw it at your feet to mock you." Malakai set his glass down. The sound was loud in the quiet room. "That room is full of liars, Morgause. They smile at me while plotting to stick a knife in my back. They bring me gifts to buy my blindness." He walked toward her, stopping only when he was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him. "You are the only person who has looked me in the eye and told me the truth in 10 years, he said, his voice low and rough. "Even if the truth was that you hate me, that bear is the only honest thing in this entire castle." Morgause looked up at him. She saw the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the weight of the crown that seemed to be crushing him slowly. She thought of the grain shipments he tried to send. She thought of the way he protected her from Gwaine. And she looked at the teddy bear, stitched with gold by the hands of a monster. A cold, terrifying realization washed over her. It settled in her stomach like a stone. "I've been fighting the wrong war," she thought. "He isn't the villain." But before she could speak, before she could ask the question that was burning on her tongue, the heavy iron lock on the study door clicked. It wasn't a normal lock. It was the distinct, grinding sound of a containment bolt sliding into place from the outside. Malakai spun around. He tried the handle. It didn't budge. "Gwaine!" Malakai hissed, his scent spiking with panic. Then, a sweet hissing sound filled the room. Pale green gas began to vent from the vents in the floorboards. "Don't breathe!" Malakai shouted, covering his nose and mouth with his arm. "It's concentrated wolfsbane." Chapter 7. "Chair," Morgause choked out, pointing at the heavy oak furniture. Malakai didn't ask questions. He didn't waste oxygen. He grabbed the solid oak chair and hurled it at the stained glass window with the force of a siege engine. The glass shattered outward in a violent explosion of color, letting in a blast of freezing winter air that swirled through the green fog. "Jump!" he roared. They vaulted over the sill, plummeting 2 stories down into a massive snowbank in the courtyard. The impact knocked the wind out of Morgause, burying her in powder. She scrambled up, coughing, expecting guards, arrows, or Gwaine himself. Instead, the courtyard was empty. Malakai clawed his way out of the snow, shaking wet white flakes from his dark hair. He looked less like a king and more like a very angry, very wet dog. "That," he wheezed, wiping green residue from his lip, "was rude, even for Gwaine." "He tried to exterminate us," Morgause hissed, checking her daggers. "We go back up there. We skin him." "No." Malakai stood, his face hardening into that unreadable mask of command. "If I kill a council elder without proof, the other 11 will incite a civil war. He wants me to lash out. He wants me to look unstable." "So we do nothing?" "We do the opposite," Malakai said, staring up at the broken window. "We proceed with the diplomatic hunt at the northern border. We show the Pax that their king is alive, healthy, and not afraid of a little gas." 24 hours later, Morgause regretted not dying in the gas. The northern border was a frozen hellscape of jagged pines and wind that felt like razors. The diplomatic hunt was supposed to be a show of strength, A chance for Malakai to kill a great elk and impress the restless border alphas. Instead, it felt like a funeral march. Morgause rode her horse close to Malakai's flank. The forest was too quiet. The birds weren't singing. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. "Stop looking at every tree like it's about to attack you," Malakai murmured, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You're making the horse nervous." "I'm making the horse prepared," Morgause muttered. "This is a setup. Gawain didn't try to gas us just to let us go on a camping trip the next day. He drove us out here." "I know," Malakai said simply. Morgause stared at him. "You know? Then why are we here?" "Because the only way to catch a trapper," Malakai said, turning to look at her with a grim smile, "is to spring the trap." As if on cue, the air whistled. It wasn't the wind. "Ambush!" Morgause screamed, diving from her saddle and tackling Malakai off his horse just as a volley of black arrows thudded into the trees where their heads had been. They hit the frozen ground hard, rolling behind a fallen log. Chaos erupted. The royal guards escorting them shouted orders, but they were dropping fast, picked off by unseen archers in the ridgeline. "Where are they?" Malakai snarled, trying to peer over the log. "High ground," Morgause pointed. She saw a flash of movement, gray cloaks blending with the bark. Then she saw the crest on their chests. She froze. "Malakai, they're wearing your colors. They're royal infantry." "Framed," Malakai growled. "Gawain wants it to look like a mutiny, or a coup." He stood up, his eyes flashing crimson. "Cover me! I'm going to shift and tear them apart." "Wait!" Morgause grabbed his arm. Her nose picked up a scent that made her blood run cold. It wasn't just steel and pine. It was sweet. Sickly sweet. "Malakai, don't—" But the king was already moving. He stepped out from cover, his body convulsing as he began the shift, fur rippling along his arms. He was a massive target. A single arrow sang through the air. It didn't miss. It struck Malakai deep in the shoulder, burying itself to the fletching. He didn't roar. He gasped a terrible wet sound. The transformation stopped instantly, the magic shattering. He stumbled back, clutching the arrow. His veins around the wound instantly turned black. "Malakai!" Morgause scrambled to him, dragging his heavy weight back behind the log. She looked at the arrow. The tip was dripping with a thick purple concentrate. "Wolfsbane!" Malakai choked out, his eyes rolling back in his head. "Concentrated, can't shift." Morgause looked up. The royal infantry were descending from the ridge, swords drawn, coming to finish the job. They were miles from the palace, alone in the freezing wilderness, and the strongest alpha in the world was paralyzed. "Can you run?" Morgause demanded, grabbing his face. Malakai's head lolled, his skin burning with fever. "Leave me," he whispered. "Go." Morgause looked at the approaching army. She looked at the man who had stitched a teddy bear with gold thread. She drew her dual blades, the steel singing in the cold air. "Shut up, Malakai," she said, standing over his fallen body. "I'm working." Chapter 8. Morgause didn't stand and fight. She wasn't stupid. There were 50 armed soldiers coming down that ridge, and she was one woman with 2 daggers and a paralyzed king who weighed as much as a depressed bison. "Sorry about this," she muttered. She grabbed Malakai by his good arm, hauled him upright, and kicked the back of his knee to force him to stumble. Then she shoved him, hard, down the steep, snowy embankment behind the log. They tumbled together in a chaotic tangle of limbs, snow, and curses, sliding down into the ravine just as the first wave of arrows turned their previous cover into a pincushion. The fall was brutal, ending with them crashing through a frozen thicket and landing in a heap at the base of a limestone cliff. "Graceful," Malakai groaned, clutching his shoulder. His skin was turning a terrifying shade of gray, the black veins spreading from the wound up his neck like spider webs. "Quiet," Morgause hissed. She spotted a narrow fissure in the rock face, a small cave entrance half hidden by snowdrifts. "Inside, now." She practically dragged him into the darkness. The cave was shallow, damp, and smelled of wet stone, but it was out of the wind. Morgause immediately turned back to the entrance, using her strength to roll a heavy boulder across the opening, leaving only a sliver of space for air. Total darkness swallowed them, save for the faint, sickly glow of the wolfsbane coursing through Malakai's blood. "Leave me," Malakai rasped, his teeth chattering so hard the words were barely intelligible. He was shivering violently, his body temperature plummeting as the poison attacked his metabolic fire. "They'll smell the blood." "If I leave you, the oath kills me, remember?" Morgause snapped, though her hands were gentle as she ripped open his tunic to inspect the wound. It was bad. The flesh was bubbling. "We're stuck together, Your Majesty, literally." "I can break the oath," he whispered, his head lolling back against the stone. "Before I go, I can release you." "Shut up, you're not going anywhere." Morgause stripped off her heavy fur cloak. It wasn't enough. The cave was a freezer, and the poison was freezing him from the inside out. He needed heat. Intense, direct heat. She hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then, she stripped off her leather armor and her tunic, leaving her in her thin undershirt. "Don't get any ideas," she muttered, crawling into the cramped space beside him. She pulled him against her, wrapping her cloak around both of them like a cocoon. The contact was shocking. His skin was like ice. Morgause pressed her chest against his, tangling her legs with his, trying to force her own shifter heat into his dying body. "Morgause, just breathe," she commanded, resting her chin on his freezing shoulder. "Fight it." "Gwaine showed me the reports," Malakai mumbled. He was delirious now, his mind drifting. "The Silver River. He said you were breeding a plague, the Red Death." Morgause froze. She pulled back slightly to look at his face in the gloom. "What?" "I saw the bodies," Malakai wept, a tear leaking from his eye. "Gwaine showed me the scout's reports. He said, if I didn't burn the pack out, the sickness would kill the whole kingdom. I didn't want to do it. I had to save them." Morgause felt the air leave her lungs. There had been no plague. Her pack had been healthy, thriving. Gwaine had lied. He had manufactured a bio-threat to trick the king into slaughtering a rival pack, removing a threat to his own power and isolating Malakai in guilt. The monster she had hated for 2 years wasn't a monster. He was a weapon that had been aimed by someone else. "I'm sorry," Malakai breathed, his voice fading. "I see their faces every night. I'm so sorry." The hatred that had fueled Morgause since the day of the fire flickered and died, replaced by a hollow, aching grief. She tightened her arms around him, burying her face in his neck. "It wasn't you," she whispered fiercely. "It was never you." Malakai's shivering began to slow, not because he was getting warmer, but because his heart was slowing down. The poison was reaching the core. "Morgause," he said, his voice gaining a sudden, terrifying clarity. He lifted his hand, his cold fingers brushing her cheek. "I'm going to break the bond. You have to run when I do." "No. I command it," he whispered. His eyes began to glow, not with the red of the Alpha, but with the fading white light of a dying soul. He began to chant the words of release. "I, Malakai, release you from—" "I said no," Morgause roared. She grabbed his hand, interlacing their fingers. She didn't pull away. She pushed. She focused on the bond, that throbbing connection in her mind, and instead of letting him cut it, she shoved her own life force down the line. It was forbidden. It was dangerous. It could kill them both. "You don't get to die to redeem yourself," she yelled, pouring her golden aura into his black, poisoned veins. "You live and you fix this." Malakai gasped, his back arching off the stone floor as her energy collided with the poison in his heart. Chapter 9. The surge of energy nearly stopped Morgause's own heart. It felt like being hooked up to a lightning rod during a hurricane. She gasped, arching back, but she didn't let go of Malakai's hand. The golden light of her aura battled the black sludge in his veins, burning it away inch by inch. When she finally collapsed against the cold stone floor, the cave was silent. Malakai was breathing, deep, ragged breaths. His skin was no longer gray. It was pale, but the black veins were gone. "You are," Malakai wheezed, his eyes fluttering open, "the most stubborn creature I have ever met." "Shut up," Morgause panted. "And get up. We have a kingdom to steal back." The trek back to the palace was a blur of agony and snow. Malakai leaned heavily on her, his strength returning slowly, but his weight was massive. They avoided the main roads, moving through the shadows like ghosts. By the time the obsidian spires of the Black Frost Palace came into view, Morgause's legs were screaming, but her mind was razor-sharp. They entered through the servants' tunnels. A pair of guards intercepted them near the kitchen, their eyes widening as they saw the disheveled, bloodied king. "Sire!" one shouted, reaching for his horn. "Silence!" Morgause barked. The command didn't come from a prisoner, it came from a general. The guard froze, the horn halfway to his lips. "The king is injured," Morgause hissed, stepping into the guard's space, radiating menace. "If word gets out, the enemies at our gates will strike. If you blow that horn, you are traitors. If you help us get him to the infirmary silently, you are patriots. Choose. Now." The guards looked at Malakai, then at the fierce woman holding him up. They saluted. "This way, General." They got him to the royal healers just as dawn broke. Morgause stood guard outside the heavy doors, refusing to let anyone pass. She was covered in mud, dried blood and sweat, but she held her head high. Then the sound of a cane tapping against stone echoed down the corridor. Elder Gawain approached, flanked by 4 elite soldiers. He stopped 10 feet from her, his nose wrinkling in distaste. "I was told the king returned," Gawain said, his voice like dry leaves. "I expected a corpse, or at least a stretcher." "He is resting," Morgause lied smoothly, crossing her arms over her chest. "The hunt was exhausting. He killed the great elk, and a few other pests." Gawain's black eyes narrowed. He looked at the closed door, then at Morgause. He knew. He knew the king should be dead. "Resting?" Gawain smiled, a thin, cruel expression. "How fortunate. He will need his strength. The solstice ball is tonight. It would be a tragedy if he were too indisposed to attend. The rumors of his weakness would spread like wildfire." "He will be there," Morgause promised, stepping forward so her face was inches from his. "And he will be very, very awake." "We shall see," Gawain whispered. "Wear something nice, Wolf. It will be a night to remember." Chapter 10. The solstice ball was a spectacle of ice and diamonds. The grand ballroom was a cavern of mirrors, lit by thousands of floating enchanted candles. The entire court was there, pack alphas, foreign dignitaries, and the Viper Council, all waiting to see if the rumors were true. Was the king dying? In the royal suite, Malakai stood before a full-length mirror. He was pale, but he stood under his own power. The healers had done their work, but the wolfsbane had left a tremor in his hands that he fought to hide. "You look terrible," Morgause said from the doorway. "And you look like a stable boy," Malakai shot back, adjusting his velvet coat. He turned to her. He held up a garment bag. "Put this on." Morgause recoiled. "I am your guard. I wear armor. Tonight, you are not just a guard. You are a statement," Malakai said, his voice firm. "Gawain expects me to be weak. He expects me to rely on soldiers. I need to show him that I have tamed the enemy. If you walk in there in armor, we look like we are at war. If you walk in there by my side, we look like we have already won." Morgause gritted her teeth and took the bag. 30 minutes later, the double doors of the ballroom swung open. The herald announced, "His Majesty, King Malakai of the Black Frost." Malakai stepped out. He looked imposing, dangerous, and very much alive. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Gawain, standing near the punch bowl, looked as if he had swallowed a lemon. Then Morgause stepped out beside him. The room went silent. She wasn't wearing leather. She was wearing a gown of deep, blood-red silk that clung to her curves like a second skin. It was backless, revealing the scars of her battles, and slit high up the thigh to allow for movement. She wore no jewelry, only the fierce golden glare of a predator. Beneath the silk strapped to her thigh was the cold weight of a starlight steel dagger. "Breathe," Malakai whispered, offering her his arm. "They are terrified of you." "They should be," Morgause murmured, taking his arm. They descended the staircase. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Malakai led her straight to the center of the floor. The orchestra, sensing the mood, began a slow, haunting waltz. Malakai placed a hand on her waist. The contact burned. "You saved my life," he said quietly, spinning her effortlessly. "In the cave. You shouldn't have done that." "I hate owing people favors," Morgause replied, scanning the room over his shoulder. "Consider my debt for not executing me paid." "Is that all this is, a debt?" Malakai pulled her closer, breaking protocol. His face was inches from hers. "Because when I look at you, Morgause, I don't see a debtor. I see a queen." Morgause's breath hitched. "Don't say that, not here." "Why? Because it scares you?" Malakai smirked, the old arrogance returning. "Good. Fear keeps you sharp." "Malakai," she warned. "Gwaine is watching. He's smiling. I don't like it when he smiles." Malakai spun her again, dipping her low. "Let him smile. Tonight we—" Click. The sound wasn't the music. It was the mechanical thunk of heavy machinery. Suddenly, every enchanted candle in the ballroom exploded. Darkness swallowed the room. Screams erupted. Before Morgause could move, a wall of purple energy, a magical containment barrier, slammed down from the ceiling, cutting the dance floor in half. Morgause stumbled back, the heat of the magic singing her skin. She was on one side. Malakai was on the other. "Morgause!" Malakai roared, pounding his fist against the translucent barrier. On Morgause's side of the wall, the darkness shifted. 20 figures in the uniform of the royal guard drew their swords. They weren't looking at the king. They were looking at her. From the shadows, Gwaine's voice echoed, amplified by magic. "The king is unwell," Gwaine announced to the screaming crowd. "Regrettably, his rabid pet has turned on him. Kill the girl." The ballroom was a cauldron of screaming nobles and trampled velvet. But inside the containment barrier, the silence was deafening. The purple energy field hummed like a high-tension wire, cutting Morgause off from the world. And from Malakai. She pressed her hand against the translucent wall. It sizzled, burning her palm. On the other side, Malakai was a blur of frantic motion. He was slamming his fists against the barrier, his mouth open in a roar she couldn't hear. His eyes were wide, filled with a panic she had never seen in him before. He wasn't afraid of the magic. He was afraid of what was standing behind her. Morgause turned slowly. The 20 royal guards, men she had trained with, men she had eaten in the mess hall with, had formed a semicircle cutting off her escape. Their swords were drawn, the steel gleaming dimly in the purple light of the barrier. "Nothing personal, General," the lead guard said, adjusting his grip on his hilt. "Gwaine pays better." "Gwaine is going to pay with his head," Morgause said, her voice steady despite the rapid thumping of her heart. "And if you step forward, you're going to pay with your limbs." "You're unarmed," the guard sneered. "And you're wearing a dress." Morgause looked down at the blood-red silk. It was beautiful, expensive, and completely impractical for a death match. The skirt was too tight for high kicks, and the train was a tripping hazard. "You're right," she murmured. She reached down, grabbed the expensive silk at her thigh, and ripped. The sound of tearing fabric echoed in the silence. She tore the skirt all the way up to her hip, exposing her leg and the holster strapped there. In one fluid motion, she drew the starlight steel dagger. The metal hummed, glowing with a faint, lethal luminescence. "I hate formal wear," she hissed. The guards charged. They came at her 3 at a time, confident in their numbers. They were wrong. They were fighting a prisoner. They forgot they were fighting a general. Morgause dropped low, sliding under the first swinging blade. She slashed the first guard's Achilles tendon, spinning on her heel to drive the pommel of her dagger into the second guard's throat. He collapsed, gasping. She didn't stop moving. She was a whirlwind of red silk and silver steel. She used the guards' bodies as shields, shoving them into each other, dancing through the chaos. But there were too many of them. A sword tip grazed her arm, slicing through the silk and drawing blood. Another struck her ribs, bruising bone. She stumbled back, breathing hard, sweat stinging her eyes. Through the purple haze of the barrier, she caught a glimpse of Malakai. He had stopped pounding on the wall. He was pressing his forehead against it, his eyes locked on hers, his claws digging into the energy field until sparks flew. He looked like a wolf trapped in a cage, watching his mate get torn apart. "Don't look," she whispered to him, though he couldn't hear. The lead guard stepped over his fallen comrades. "End it," he commanded. The remaining 12 guards tightened the circle. They raised their swords in unison. There was nowhere to run. Her back hit the humming energy of the barrier. She could feel Malakai's heat on the other side, mere inches away, yet an entire world apart. Morgause raised her dagger, preparing for the final strike. She wasn't going to win this, but she was going to take as many of them with her as she could. Chapter 12. Morgause didn't wait for the strike. She didn't flinch. She went feral. The moment the first sword swung down, she dropped into a split, the blade whistling harmlessly over her head. She drove her dagger upward, burying it in the attacker's thigh. He screamed, dropping his weapon. Morgause caught the falling sword before it hit the ground. Now she had 2 blades. She rose like a revenant, dual-wielding the heavy broadsword and her light dagger. She became a blur of violence. She parried a strike to her left, spun, and kicked a guard into the barrier. The magical field electrocuted him, throwing him back unconscious. The field, she realized. It has a source. She scanned the room while ducking under a decapitation strike. In the far corner of the containment zone, pulsing with a sick purple light, was a small obsidian pyramid embedded in the floor. A runestone. "Cover the stone!" the lead guard shouted, realizing she had spotted it. "Too late," Morgause snarled. She didn't try to fight her way to it. She didn't have the time. She hurled the heavy broadsword with all her strength. It wasn't an elegant throw, but it was powerful. The sword spun through the air, crashing into the chest of the guard blocking the stone, knocking him backward. He fell onto the obsidian pyramid. The combined weight of the armored man and the heavy steel cracked the fragile rune. The sound was like a thunderclap. The purple barrier flickered, shrieked, and then shattered into a million sparks of harmless light. Before the sparks even hit the floor, a black blur slammed into the remaining guards. Malakai was there. He didn't use a weapon. He used his hands. He grabbed the lead guard by the breastplate and threw him, across the ballroom. He backhanded another with enough force to shatter a jaw. He was a force of nature, a hurricane of rage that had finally breached the levee. Within 10 seconds, every traitor was on the ground, groaning or unconscious. Malakai spun around, his chest heaving, his eyes glowing with that terrifying, beautiful crimson. He scanned Morgause for injuries. He saw the cut on her arm, the bruise on her ribs, the torn dress. "You're bleeding," he choked out, stepping over a body to get to her. "I'm fine," Morgause panted, dropping her dagger. Adrenaline was shaking her hands. "I handled it." "You almost died," Malakai growled. He grabbed her face in his hands, checking her pupils, his thumbs brushing away the sweat and blood on her cheek. "I watched them corner you. I couldn't get to you." "But you're here now," she whispered. The fear in his eyes broke. He didn't say another word. He crashed his mouth onto hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, possessive, and tasted of copper and panic. Malakai kissed her like he was trying to breathe for both of them, his hands tangling in her hair, pulling her against him as if he wanted to merge their skeletons so she could never be separated from him again. Morgause kissed him back just as fiercely, her hands gripping the lapels of his velvet coat. For a moment, The ruined ballroom, the unconscious guards, and the screaming nobles faded away. There was only the heat of him, the steady beat of his heart against hers, and the undeniable truth that the hatred was gone, replaced by something far more volatile. Malakai pulled back, breathless, resting his forehead against hers. "If you ever scare me like that again," he whispered, "I will lock you in a tower." "Try it," Morgause smirked, though her voice trembled, "and I'll burn the tower down." They stood there amidst the wreckage, survivors of the night. But the moment of peace was shattered before it could truly begin. From the shattered windows of the palace, a sound drifted in on the cold wind. It started low, a rumble in the earth, and grew into a deafening, unnatural roar. It wasn't one wolf. It was thousands. Malakai's head snapped up. His face went pale. "That's not the pack," he said, his voice turning to ice. "That's the hollow." Chapter 13. The roar didn't stop. It vibrated through the floorboards, shaking dust from the crystal chandeliers overhead. It wasn't the cohesive, rhythmic howl of a pack communicating, it was a cacophony of mindless hunger. "What is the hollow?" Morgause shouted over the rising panic of the crowd. "The old myths call them the empty ones," Malakai grimaced, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the grand staircase. "Wolves stripped of their souls by dark alchemy. They don't feel pain. They don't stop. And Gwaine just unleashed an army of them on his own city." As if to punctuate his sentence, the massive stained glass windows overlooking the balcony exploded inward. Shards of glass rained down like jagged hail. Through the breach poured a tide of nightmares. They were wolves, but wrong. Their fur was patchy, their eyes milky white, and black ichor dripped from their jaws instead of saliva. They threw themselves onto the fleeing nobles with mechanical brutality. "Upstairs," Malakai commanded, shoving a screaming duke out of the way to clear a path. "To the throne room. It's the only room with reinforced doors." They ran. Behind them, the ballroom turned into a slaughterhouse. Morgause didn't look back. She focused on the stairs, on the slick marble under her torn boots, and on the warmth of Malakai's hand in hers. They reached the second-floor landing, only to find the corridor swarming. 3 hollow wolves scrambled over the railing, snapping at Malakai's throat. He released Morgause's hand and roared, shifting his arm, just his arm, into a massive furred limb tipped with obsidian claws. He backhanded the first beast, sending it flying over the banister. He caught the second by the throat and crushed its windpipe. It didn't make a sound, it just went limp. "There are too many," Malakai yelled, kicking the third one away. He turned to her, his eyes desperate. "Morgause, the servant tunnels are behind that tapestry. Go. Get out of the city." Morgause brutally stabbed a hollow wolf that had lunged at her, wiping the black ichor from her face. "Excuse me?" "This is a massacre!" Malakai grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. "I can hold them here long enough for you to escape. Go." Morgause laughed. It was a sharp, jagged sound. She stepped out of his grip and dual-wielded her daggers, spinning them in her hands. "You really don't listen, do you?" She looked him in the eye, the gold in her irises flaring. "I didn't run when you were the enemy, Malakai. I didn't run when the assassin had a crossbow. I am the Iron Rose, and I don't run from weeds." She turned and threw a dagger into the eye of a leaping wolf, killing it instantly. "Now, are we going to argue, or are we going to kill these things?" Malakai stared at her for a split second, a mixture of awe and terror on his face. Then he grinned, a bloodthirsty, feral grin. "Fine. We do it your way." Chapter 14. The corridor to the throne room was a gauntlet of blood and shadow. Malakai acted as the battering ram, using his sheer alpha strength to smash through the lines of the hollow while Morgause moved in his wake, a precision instrument finishing off anything he missed. They were 10 feet from the heavy iron doors of the throne room when Malakai stopped. He turned to face the horde bottlenecking in the hallway. "Open the doors!" he shouted to her. "I'll hold the rear!" Morgause sprinted for the handle, but as she reached for the iron ring, A shadow detached itself from the alcove beside the door. A cane struck her wrist, hard. Morgause hissed, spinning around, daggers raised. Elder Gawain stood there. He looked impeccably calm amidst the apocalypse he had started. He smoothed the lapel of his velvet coat, his black eyes glittering with triumph. "You are persistent," Gawain noted, glancing down at the chaos where Malakai was fighting off 6 wolves at once. "But persistence is just a prettier word for stupidity." "Get out of my way, old man," Morgause snarled, "or I will mount your head on that door." "Always so violent," Gawain tutted. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a jagged, pulsating stone. It wasn't obsidian. It looked like frozen blood. "I'm not here to fight you, General. I'm here to make a trade." Morgause hesitated. "What trade?" "Open the doors," Gawain whispered, stepping closer. "Let the hollow in to consume the king. Do this, and I will use the bloodstone to bring them back." Morgause froze. "Who?" "Your pack." Gawain smiled, sensing her weakness. "The Silver River. I can resurrect them. All of them. Your mother. Your father. The soldiers you failed. Just step aside, Morgause. 1 life for 3,000. It's a soldier's math." For a heartbeat, the world slowed down. Morgause looked at the stone. She thought of her family. She thought of the guilt that had eaten her alive for 2 years. Then, she looked past Gawain. She saw Malakai, covered in black blood, fighting like a demon to keep the monsters away from her. He wasn't fighting for his crown. He was fighting for her. 1 life for 3,000, Morgause repeated softly. She lowered her dagger. Gawain's smile widened. "Smart girl." "Here's my counteroffer," Morgause said. She lunged. She didn't aim for his heart. She aimed for his leg. She drove her dagger through his thigh, pinning him to the wooden doorframe. Gawain shrieked, dropping the stone. It shattered on the floor. "My pack rests in peace," Morgause snarled, twisting the blade. "You will rest in hell." She ripped the dagger free, grabbed the heavy iron handle of the throne room door, and shoved it open. "Malakai! Now!" Malakai heard her. He unleashed a shockwave of alpha energy that knocked the front line of wolves backward, buying him 2 seconds. He turned and sprinted, diving through the open doorway. Morgause slammed the massive doors shut behind him. She threw the locking bolt, a solid bar of steel as thick as her arm, into place just as the first heavy body slammed against the wood from the other side. Boom. The door shook, dust falling from the frame. Boom. "We're safe," Morgause gasped, sliding down the door to the floor, her chest heaving. "No," Malakai said. His voice was hollow. Morgause looked up. Malakai wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at the center of the throne room. Standing by the throne, surrounded by 20 elite armored guards, was Gawain. Morgause looked back at the door she had just locked. The Gawain she had stabbed outside. His body was dissolving into black smoke. "A shadow clone," Malakai whispered, drawing himself up to his full height. He was never in the hallway. He was waiting inside. Gawain, the real Gawain, sat on the king's throne, holding a spear made of pure, gleaming starlight silver. He smiled, and this time there was no offer of mercy. "Welcome home, Your Majesty," Gawain said. "Please try not to bleed on the carpet." Chapter 15. "Get off my chair," Malakai said. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, vibrating rumble that made the stained glass windows rattle in their frames. Gawain didn't move. He sat comfortably on the obsidian throne, resting the starlight silver spear across his knees like a scepter. "Possession is 9/10 of the law, Malakai, and currently I possess the throne, the army, and the high ground. You possess a dead girl walking." He gestured to the 20 elite guards forming a phalanx between them and the dais. These weren't the standard palace guards Morgause had dismantled in the ballroom. These were the Crimson Guard, heavily armored, magically enhanced, and notoriously hard to kill. "Morgause," Malakai murmured, his eyes locked on the enemy. "Stay behind me." "We've been over this," Morgause said, shifting her grip on her dual daggers. I don't do behind, I do beside. Then try not to die, Malakai growled. That is an order. You first, Your Majesty. They moved as one. Malakai hit the line like a battering ram, his alpha strength crumpling the breastplate of the first guard. Morgause slipped into his wake like smoke, her daggers finding the weak points in the armor, armpits, knee joints, throats. It was a beautiful, bloody dance. For 2 years they had been enemies, studying each other's tactics across a battlefield. Now that knowledge made them a flawless unit. When Malakai swung left, Morgause covered his right. When she ducked, he swung over her head. They were a whirlwind of claws and steel, but they were tired. They had fought through the ballroom, the stairs, and the corridor. Malakai was slowing down. A guard managed to clip his shoulder with a mace, sending him stumbling back. "Malakai!" Morgause shouted, parrying a sword strike that nearly took her head off. "I'm fine!" he roared, ripping the mace from the guard's hands and using it to crush the man's helmet. They were winning. Slowly, brutally, they were thinning the herd. The floor was slick with blood and unconscious bodies. Only 3 guards remained standing, circling Malakai, keeping him distracted with coordinated spear thrusts. Morgause finished off her opponent and turned to help him. That was when she looked up at the dais. Gawain wasn't watching the fight anymore. He was standing. He had raised the starlight silver spear. The tip glowed with a blinding, pure white light, a metal forged specifically to kill alphas. It didn't wound. It obliterated. He wasn't aiming at her. He was aiming at Malakai, whose back was turned as he grappled with the last 3 guards. "Malakai!" Morgause screamed. The sound was lost in the clash of steel. Malakai didn't hear her. He roared, lifting a guard over his head. Gawain grinned. He pulled his arm back, his form perfect. He threw the spear. Chapter 16. Time didn't just slow down, it shattered. Morgause saw every detail with agonizing clarity. She saw the dust motes dancing in the air. She saw the sweat flying from Malakai's hair as he threw the guard. She saw the silver spear leave Gawain's hand, cutting through the air like a bolt of lightning, silent and inevitable. She was too far away to push him. She was too far away to deflect it. She did the only math that mattered. Distance divided by speed equals sacrifice. Morgause didn't think about her life. She didn't think about the throne. She thought about the teddy bear with the gold stitching sitting on a shelf, and the man who had been lonely enough to fix it. She lunged. She threw herself into the path of the projectile, not with grace, but with desperate, flailing violence. Thud. The sound was sickening, wet and heavy. The impact lifted Morgause off her feet. The spear didn't just pierce her, it burned. The starlight silver seared through her leather armor, through her ribs, and exited her back. It was like being stabbed by a star. She hit the floor hard, sliding to a stop at Malakai's feet. The entire room froze. The remaining guards dropped their weapons, terrified by what had just happened. Even Gawain looked stunned. He hadn't accounted for the variable. Malakai turned around, grinning, ready to tell her they had won. His smile died. "Morgause?" He fell to his knees, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch the burning silver shaft protruding from her chest. "No. No, no, no." Morgause coughed, blood bubbling past her lips. It hurt to breathe. It hurt to exist. She looked up at him, her vision swimming. He looked blurry. He looked scared. "You..." She wheezed, grabbing his wrist with a bloody hand. "You have terrible situational awareness." "Shh, don't speak," Malakai choked out, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "I'll fix it. I'll get the healers. Just don't close your eyes." "Malakai," she whispered. The cold was spreading now, starting at her fingertips and racing toward her heart. The pain was fading, replaced by a heavy, dark numbness. "Told you. I was a bad gift." "You are the only gift," Malakai sobbed, pulling her head onto his lap, heedless of the blood soaking his trousers. "You are the only thing I have, please." Morgause, that is an order. Do not leave me. Sorry, Alpha, she breathed, her voice barely audible. I resign. Her hand slipped from his wrist. Her eyes, the color of fierce, molten gold, dulled to a flat, lifeless brown. Her chest stopped moving. Silence descended on the throne room. Absolute, heavy silence. Then the castle shook. It started as a vibration in the floor, deep within the bedrock. Then the stones began to crack. The air in the room grew instantly cold, freezing the blood on the floor. Malakai lowered his head, his shoulders shaking. A sound tore from his throat, not a scream and not a roar. It was something older, something broken. Shadows began to bleed from his skin. They didn't look like normal shadows. They looked like tears in the fabric of reality. They swirled around him, swallowing the light, growing taller, darker, and hungrier. Gawain took a step back, his face draining of color. What is this? Malakai lifted his head. His eyes were gone. There were no pupils, no irises, no whites. There was only the void. Run! The thing that used to be Malakai whispered. Chapter 17. Gawain didn't run. He was too arrogant. He signaled the remaining 3 guards to attack. Kill it! Gawain shrieked, his voice cracking. It's just a wolf. It wasn't just a wolf. The thing that had replaced Malakai didn't move with muscles. It moved like spilled ink. It surged forward, a tidal wave of living darkness. The first guard didn't even scream. The shadows simply washed over him, and when they receded, there was nothing left. No armor, no body, just clean stone. The other 2 guards dropped their weapons and scrambled backward, clawing at the floor tiles in terror. The shadow beast ignored them. It had only one target. Gawain stumbled back against the throne, raising his hands to cast a spell, but the magic sputtered and died. The void consumed all light, all energy. The beast rose up, towering over the dais, a nightmare of shifting smoke and glowing violet veins. Wait, Gawain pleaded, pressing himself against the obsidian chair. We can negotiate. I can give you the world. The beast opened its jaw. There was no sound of a growl, only the terrifying silence of a vacuum. It lunged. Gawain vanished. There was no blood. There was no body. 1 second the elder was there, begging for his life, and the next, the throne was empty. The darkness had simply erased him from existence. With the threat gone, the silence in the room changed. It wasn't fearful anymore. It was mournful. The towering shadow collapsed inward, shrinking, solidifying, until Malakai lay on the cold stone floor, naked, human, and shivering. He crawled back to Morgause. She was still dead. Her skin was turning the color of ash. The silver spear was still lodged in her chest. No, Malakai rasped, his voice sounding like it was filled with broken glass. He gripped the spear shaft. His hands sizzled as they touched the holy silver, but he didn't flinch. With a guttural roar of agony, he ripped the weapon from her body and threw it across the room. The wound didn't close. She didn't breathe. You don't get to resign, Malakai sobbed, hovering over her. I reject your resignation. He brought his wrist to his mouth and bit down, tearing the vein open. Dark, heavy blood, charged with the lingering, crackling energy of the void, welled up. He pressed his wrist to her blue lips, forcing the essence into her mouth. Drink, he commanded, pouring his own life force into her. Take it all. Take my soul if you have to. Just come back. Nothing happened. Malakai leaned his forehead against hers, his tears mixing with the blood on her face. He pushed harder, mentally shoving every ounce of his alpha power, every shred of the ancient magic he possessed, down the broken bond between them. He felt his own heart stutter. He was killing himself to jumpstart her. Morgause! He screamed, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling. A spark. It started in her chest, a faint golden glow beneath the skin. Then, a gasp. A terrible, ragged intake of air that sounded like a drowning woman breaking the surface. Morgause's back arched off the floor, her eyes snapped open. They weren't brown anymore. They weren't even the gold of a normal shifter. They were burning, molten starlight. Chapter 18. 3 months later, the kingdom of Black Frost looked very different. The snow was still there and the wind still bit, but the fear was gone. The heads of the corrupt elders were no longer attached to their bodies, and the new council, comprising elected alphas from every pack, including the Silver River remnants, was actually arguing about trade routes instead of executions. In the royal suite, the morning sun streamed through the repaired balcony doors. "Stop moving," Malakai grumbled, trying to fasten the clasp of his ceremonial cloak. "You're making me nervous." Morgause sat on the edge of the massive bed, polishing a dagger with a silk handkerchief. She looked healthier than she ever had. The scar on her chest was a jagged starburst of silver skin, a badge of honor she refused to hide. "I'm not moving," she said, flipping the dagger in the air and catching it. "I'm existing aggressively. There's a difference." Malakai abandoned the clasp and turned to look at her. He looked different too, lighter. The shadows under his eyes were gone, replaced by laugh lines. He walked over, took the dagger from her hand, and placed it on the nightstand. "It's our first official solstice as co-rulers," he said, resting his hands on her knees. "Try not to threaten anyone with dismemberment today, at least until after dessert." "No promises," Morg smirked. "If the alpha of the Ironwood pack looks at me wrong again, he's losing a finger. He looks at you like that because he's terrified of you," Malakai pointed out. "You did come back from the dead with laser eyes. It's intimidating." "It's efficient." Morgause stood up, smoothing the front of her deep blue velvet tunic. She reached under the bed and pulled out a small, wrapped box. "Speaking of efficiency, I got you something." Malakai raised an eyebrow. "I thought we agreed no gifts. We gave each other the gift of not dying. That seemed sufficient." "Open it." Malakai took the box. It was light. He tore the paper, revealing a small wooden case. Inside lay a tiny, impeccably crafted object. It was a suit of armor, but not for a man. It was a miniature breastplate, fashioned from leather and gold filigree, sized perfectly for a plush toy. Malakai looked from the box to the shelf above the fireplace. There, sitting on its velvet cushion, was the one-eared teddy bear. He walked over to the shelf and gently picked up the bear. With the focus of a surgeon, he strapped the tiny armor onto the toy. It fit perfectly. The bear now looked like a ragged, fluffy warrior ready for battle. Malakai laughed. It wasn't the dark, terrifying laugh of the Winter King. It was the bright, warm laugh of a man who was finally free. "He needed protection," Morgause said, coming up behind him and wrapping her arms around his waist. "He's a high-value target." Malakai turned in her arms, pressing a kiss to her forehead. He looked at the bear, the symbol of the insult that had started a war and the love that had ended it. "You're ridiculous," he murmured against her skin. "I'm a genius," she corrected. Malakai smirked, holding the armored bear up to the light. "You know, when you threw this at my head, I thought it was an act of war." "It was," Morgause smiled, her golden eyes shining. "Well," Malakai said, placing the bear back on the mantle where it would watch over their reign for the rest of their lives. "I stand by my original statement." He pulled her in for a kiss that promised 1,000 more winters together. "Best gift ever."